Anyway, we move on to another great exclusive from our very own Charlie Peters about a Rotherham survivor who's hunted for justice for decades. In the mid-2000s, while a teenager living in supported accommodation, this victim, who Charlie's spoken to, was groomed and exploited by gangs of men in Rotherham. Her abuse quickly escalated from grooming and she was sexually exploited on several occasions.
Now, only one person has ever been convicted for her abuse, but many others were involved in her exploitation, and she still seeks a missing file crucial to the prosecution. Well, joining us now, GB News' national reporter Charlie Peters. Charlie, tell us more.
Well, I've known Elizabeth for years. It's not her real name. She still lives in secret due to the nature of the abuse that she endured and the fact that so many of the perpetrators from that period still walk freely around South Yorkshire. And of all the cases in her life that I've learnt about and heard compelling testimony about, this one really stands out. Her being trafficked from Rotherham to Bristol, a 6-hour drive when she was used as a commodity as part of a drug deal between two gangs. Two Pakistani men took her down on that day in the mid-2000s. She was abandoned in the town. The local police, when they were phoned up and informed about it, said, "We're not a taxi service. She'll have to make her own way back." She was on a train from Bristol to Rotherham for several hours, supported by a whistleblower I know, who was her support worker at the time in the supported accommodation she was in. When she returned, they took all the evidence they could. They captured all the information about that incident and they kept it in a file. Now, you both know that, and so does the nation now, that for that period in Rotherham, as indeed across the country, police officers and local authorities were really failing to support victims of group localised child sexual exploitation. They didn't see them as victims, they didn't believe them, they didn't think they were credible, and frankly, they didn't care. So when they had all that evidence and they went to the police, nothing was done. Years later, when the scandal broke in Rotherham, the National Crime Agency stood in and launched Operation Stovewood, which is their historic investigation into non-familial allegations of sexual abuse in Rotherham. This case was brought out, Elizabeth's trafficking to Bristol. And she had nicknames for these men. She didn't know their real names, but they are immense investigators. And after a couple of years, they found them. They, working with the CPS, charged them. But when it came to court, a judge threw out the case because they said there wasn't sufficient evidence. Now, I think we have a clip we can play of an interview I had with Elizabeth last month talking about this case and why it was so important to her.
Trafficked from Rotherham down to Bristol. By two Pakistani males. The thing is with CSE, it's like a game of lottery. People get your number and they just pass numbers around. They just appeared one day. It was already out of control, but that's when it becomes slightly, it was up in the game a little bit, yeah. They were trying to give us ecstasy and drinking. I knew quickly that there was something not right with their behaviours and things like that. When we got into Bristol, I can always remember, I've got distorted memories of it, but I can always remember like entering Bristol, but there was like a wall with water coming down. I'll always remember that. And then when we got to the car auction place, told us to get out and just left us.
Now, unbeknownst to the NCA, at the same time, Elizabeth, I've known her for years, she is a pugnacious character. She wants her justice. She went to Rush House, the supported accommodation she was living in at the time, asking for the file that was recorded on her when she returned from Bristol. When she arrived at the facility, she tells me that a council worker was there to greet her, to say that she was there to support her through the process. She went in there, they didn't have that information. They had some basic administrative files, they could prove they had information on her, but not that missing file. A separate whistleblower has told me that they, also separately to this incident, went to the council and asked them to investigate missing files from that location. I've seen an email from Rotherham Borough Council saying that they had appointed an external investigator to look into this case. But last week and this week, Rotherham have told me they cannot find any evidence of that investigation taking place. That missing file is somewhere, I believe. It's somewhere, it's crucial to this case, and a judge threw out that prosecution because of a lack of evidence. Where is it, and why was it going missing?
So very briefly, Charlie, so what happens now? Just looking for it now.
Well, we'll break the story today and we'll see what comes out of the woodwork, because there are more questions to be asked about this case, and I've spoken to several whistleblowers for it, not only Elizabeth and that person who went to the council to ask for that investigation, but also her support worker, who said that Elizabeth's file was among the most extensive of any of the girls and boys she worked with because of the extent of the abuse that she endured. There was so much there, so much that could be used in a court of law, but it never was.
Well, these girls have been failed successively over and over and over and over again, haven't they? Charlie Peters. And I was off in the week when you broke the story of Wikipedia describing the grooming gang scandal as a moral panic. I mean, that just shows the apathy towards the whole situation from all quarters.
Charlie, incredible investigation. Keep it going. Yeah.
Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you.
OK, just 19 days to go. Who's counting until the government's first autumn budget? Britain holds its breath as to who and what will be taxed higher. And reading the headlines this morning, it seems like capital gains tax may rise.
Chancellor Rachel Reeves denies plans to increase capital gains tax to 39%. But do you believe her? Or would we see another U-turn? Well, joining us now, GB News' political correspondent, Olivia Utley. Olivia, so is there much credence to this sort of rumour that's going around, 39%?
Well, 39% was the figure which was being touted during the election campaign. And raising capital gains tax seemed to be quite an obvious move for Labour. Capital gains tax is sort of traditionally paid by richer people, those with other forms of income other than their earnings. And Labour said repeatedly that what they would like to see is that those with the broadest shoulders bear the most of the burden for the problems, the financial difficulties that Britain finds itself in now. So that's where the 39% figure came from. But actually, it's possible that Rachel Reeves, looking forward to the budget, decides not to raise capital gains by that much at all. Why is that? Well, because ideologically, it seems to make sense for Labour to raise capital gains. And if you make basic calculations, yes, that would raise quite a lot of money. But when you dive a bit deeper into the figures, and most importantly, the way that people behave when they are taxed, then you see a very different picture. And that's what Rachel Reeves and Treasury officials only seem to be realising now. As Paul Johnson of the IFS, an independent, well-regarded think tank, has pointed out, if people are taxed more, they change their behaviour. 2/3 of all of the money from capital gains that is raised in this country is raised from just 12,000 people. So you only need a small number of people to behave differently because of the threat of taxation to actually bring down revenue. So what could happen is you end up in a situation where, half of those 12,000 people, say, choose either to leave the country because they don't want to be exposed to such a high level of capital gains tax, or they decide not to sell the assets, not to sell the property, for example, which would mean that they had to pay this punitive amount of capital gains. So actually, by increasing that tax, you could end up in a situation where the Treasury is seeing lower revenue for capital gains. And that is the question that the Treasury is pondering between now and the budget on October the 30th.
Olivia Utley, thank you very much. That's the problem with a lot of these Labour policies. They rely on variables that they have no control of.